On the morning of May 27, 1968, families gathered on the pier in Norfolk, Virginia, staring out at an empty line of gray water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a nuclear attack submarine named USS Scorpion was supposed to appear, her black hull cutting through the waves as she came home from patrol. She was due in at 1:00 p.m. local time came and went. The brass band that had been arranged never started playing. The pier stayed quiet, except for the sound of wind and the occasional nervous joke that didn't quite land. At first, no one panicked. Submarines ran late all the time, especially during the Cold War. A last-minute drill, a minor technical issue, a coded detour ordered from higher up. There were 100 reasons why a boat might be delayed. But as the hours dragged on, a different kind of silence settled over the waiting crowd. Officers who should have been visible and relaxed suddenly disappeared into offices. Phone calls were made behind closed doors. No one would quite say the words out loud, but everyone could feel it. Something was very wrong. 5 days earlier, Scorpion had been somewhere in the Atlantic, heading west from the Mediterranean Sea. She had reportedly been shadowing a Soviet naval group near the Azores, quietly listening to propeller noise and radio traffic in the dark water below. Then, in the late hours of May 20th, the submarine sent a routine radio message. Her commanding officer reported that he was closing in on the Soviet group and would soon turn for home. After that, there was only static. That message would be the last confirmed sign of life from the submarine and her 99 men. For the families in Norfolk, the delay began as an inconvenience and slowly turned into a nightmare. Some of them had received letters from their sailors only days before, filled with casual lines about being busy and coming home soon. Now, those same people watched the empty horizon, replaying every word, wondering if they had missed some hidden hint. Children grew bored and then anxious. Parents who had once been Navy spouses during calmer times recognized the look on the officers' faces. This wasn't just a late arrival. This was something else. Behind the scenes, senior commanders moved quickly from concern to crisis. Scorpion was not just any submarine. She was nuclear-powered and carried nuclear-tipped weapons. If she had suffered some kind of accident or attack, the implications went far beyond the loss of a single boat. Admirals debated whether to assume a simple mechanical failure or to consider the worst-case scenarios, a reactor problem, a collision with a Soviet submarine, or an incident that might escalate into an international flashpoint. While the public was told as little as possible, inside the command centers, the atmosphere was tense. When Scorpion failed to arrive in Norfolk, the U.S. Navy launched a massive search. Surface ships, patrol aircraft, and other submarines swept huge sections of the Atlantic, looking for any trace of wreckage, an oil slick, or an emergency beacon. Somewhere on the ocean floor, they knew, was a nuclear reactor, 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes, and nearly 100 missing sailors. Admirals gave cautious public statements about communication difficulties while privately fearing the worst. On June 5, 1968, the words "no family ever wants to hear" were finally made official. USS Scorpion and her crew were presumed lost. Their names were struck from the active rolls. Their boat's name was quietly removed from the Navy's vessel register. But one enormous question remained, a question that has haunted investigators, families, and historians for decades. How does a state-of-the-art nuclear attack submarine simply vanish beneath the waves? To understand why Scorpion's disappearance still feels so unsettling, you have to look at the kind of submarine she was, and the world she sailed through. USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, designed to be fast, quiet, and deadly. Built in the early years of the Cold War, she was essentially a hunter, a shadow that could follow enemy ships, track other submarines, and, if necessary, fire torpedoes or launch nuclear-tipped weapons from beneath the surface. By 1968, submarine warfare had become a hidden arms race. On the surface, politicians talked about treaties and diplomacy. Below the waves, the US and the Soviet Union played an invisible game of cat and mouse, stalking each other's ballistic missile submarines, tapping undersea cables, and pushing both crews and machines to their limits. Submarines like Scorpion were at the center of that secret battlefield. They operated in near-total radio silence, often weeks at a time, thousands of feet from the nearest breathable air. Life on board a nuclear attack submarine was both routine and suffocating. The crew lived in narrow metal corridors where lights never truly went out, and the air always smelled faintly of oil, machinery, and recycled breath. Sailors shared bunks in shifts, known as hot racking, because there simply weren't enough beds for everyone on board. Every pipe and valve had a purpose. Every checklist had to be followed, because one mistake could mean a fire, a flood, or a loss of power far below the surface. Day and night blurred together into watch rotations and maintenance tasks. Outside, there was only darkness and the dull hum of the reactor. Scorpion herself had not had an easy few years. In 1963, another American nuclear submarine, USS Thresher, had imploded during sea trials, killing all 129 people on board. In response, the U.S. Navy launched a sweeping safety overhaul known as SubSafe. Boats were inspected, systems were modified, and procedures changed. But Scorpion was one of the submarines that never received the full set of upgrades. She had undergone a shortened overhaul, meaning some of the recommended modifications were delayed or never carried out. Even among submariners, there was a sense that Scorpion was a hard-worked boat that hadn't been given the attention she needed. In the months leading up to her final patrol, Scorpion experienced a series of mechanical problems. There were reports of persistent refrigeration leaks, an electrical fire caused by water shorting a shore power cable, and other minor malfunctions that added up to the feeling of a boat that was aging faster than it should. Some crew members later recalled nicknames like Scrap Iron, a dark joke about their own submarine. Officially, the Navy still considered her safe to deploy. Unofficially, a few sailors requested transfers rather than go back to sea on her again. Her final commanding officer, Commander Francis Slattery, had taken charge only months before she disappeared. He was experienced, respected, and by all accounts careful. Yet he was also working with a submarine that carried the legacy of incomplete safety work and a very tight operational schedule. Scorpion's deployments were frequent and demanding. The Cold War did not pause for maintenance windows, and when a boat was needed to track Soviet activity, someone had to go. Whether that pressure played any role in what ultimately happened is still debated, but it forms an important part of the backdrop. Despite these concerns, Scorpion left Norfolk in February 1968 for a deployment with the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. She performed the usual mix of training, surveillance, and intelligence gathering, coming into a few ports and then slipping back into the deep. In May, she headed west toward home. Along the way, she was reportedly tasked with one more job: swing near the Azores, take a look at a Soviet naval formation, and report what she found. It was a routine order, the kind of thing nuclear attack submarines did every day. But somewhere between that last message and her scheduled return to Norfolk, routine turned into catastrophe. When the Navy finally admitted that Scorpion was missing, they were forced to answer a terrifying question. How do you find a submarine that has vanished in thousands of meters of open ocean? The Atlantic is not a lake or a coastal shelf. It is a deep, shifting, and largely featureless expanse. If a submarine breaks apart and sinks out there, it doesn't leave behind a floating shipwreck. It can fall 3 kilometers straight down, hit the seabed, and simply disappear from human sight. The first step was to gather whatever clues they had. During the Cold War, the United States maintained a secret network of underwater listening posts, a system known as SOSUS. These hydrophones sat on the ocean floor, listening for the low-frequency sounds of submarine propellers, torpedo launches, and explosions. After Scorpion went missing, analysts began combing through SOSUS recordings from the days and hours around May 22nd, the date the Navy believed she was lost. Buried in the audio was something that sounded horribly familiar: the rapid, cracking roar of a submarine hull collapsing under immense pressure. SOSUS had been created primarily to track Soviet submarines as they moved in and out of their bases, but in this case, it became a forensic tool. Analysts replayed the recordings again and again, measuring the timing between the different sounds and estimating how deeply a submarine would have to be for its hull to implode with that kind of violence. It was like listening to an accident in the dark and trying to reconstruct the scene from the sounds alone. A muffled bang, another smaller noise half a second later, and then the shattering thunder of steel collapsing and seawater rushing in. To narrow down the search even further, the Navy turned to a small group of scientists and mathematicians led by John Craven, chief scientist of the Special Projects Office. Using a technique called Bayesian search theory, the team combined every scrap of information they had. Last known position, ocean currents, acoustic data, even expert guesses, into a set of probabilities. Instead of searching blindly, they created a search box on the seafloor where Scorpion was most likely to be. It was still enormous, but it was better than the whole Atlantic. In the late autumn of 1968, months after Scorpion had failed to come home, a Navy research ship called USNS Mizar began towing deep-sea cameras back and forth across the search area. The process was tedious and exhausting. Long days of nothing but grey mud on grainy black-and-white screens. Then, on one of those passes, the cameras captured something different. In the dim light of the deep sea, a curved metal shape loomed into view, torn and twisted but unmistakable. The wreck of USS Scorpion had been found, more than 3,000 meters down, some 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. When deep-diving vehicles like the Bathyscaphe Trieste II and later the submersible Alvin visited the wreck site, the photographs they sent back were both stunning and horrifying. Scorpion lay shattered on the seafloor. Her hull had broken into several major sections. The operations compartment, where most of the crew would have been, had been crushed inward, evidence of a massive implosion. The engine room appeared telescoped forward, the metal folded like a collapsed soda can. The sail had torn away and lay on its side. Yet other parts of the submarine, like the torpedo room, appeared relatively intact, as if frozen in the last moments before disaster. Those who had to study the pictures faced a difficult emotional balance. On one hand, they were engineers and investigators, looking for fracture lines, scorch marks, and patterns of deformation that might point to a cause. On the other hand, they knew that every twisted panel and shattered compartment represented a place where real people had worked, slept, and joked with each other only weeks earlier. There were no bodies visible in the dark interior of the wreck, but everyone understood that Scorpion was now a tomb. What the wreck showed was clear. Scorpion had exceeded her crush depth and been destroyed by the weight of the ocean itself. What it did not show was why. There were no obvious signs of a collision with another submarine or a large external explosion. The damage pattern suggested a catastrophic failure that began inside the boat, or at least inside her pressure hull, and quickly spiraled out of control. With the wreck located but the key evidence still missing, the Navy convened a formal court of inquiry. Its job was to answer the question the families wanted most: what had happened to their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons? When the Navy's court of inquiry released its report, the official conclusion was almost as unsettling as the loss itself. The exact cause of Scorpion's sinking could not be determined. Behind that careful sentence, however, sat a list of possible scenarios, each one a nightmare in its own way. They all had one thing in common. Once the chain of events began, the crew would have had very little time to react. One leading theory focused on something every submarine relies on: its batteries. Some investigators believe that hydrogen gas may have built up during a battery charge while Scorpion was operating at periscope depth. If that gas were not properly ventilated and then ignited, by a spark, a switch, or even static, it could cause an internal explosion. Acoustic data from SOSUS did record what sounded like two smaller blasts, followed by the much louder implosion of the hull. In this scenario, a hydrogen explosion could have knocked out critical systems, started fires, and left the crew fighting for their lives as the submarine sank uncontrollably. Another possibility involved the very weapons Scorpion carried. At the time, she was equipped with wire-guided Mark 37 torpedoes, some of which used silver-zinc batteries that were later found to have dangerous tendencies. Engineers discovered that under vibration and stress, these batteries could leak, overheat, and in rare cases, burn violently. One version of events suggests that a torpedo battery may have overheated in its tube, creating what submariners dread most: a hot-running torpedo that arms itself while still on board. Faced with a live warhead a few meters from their control room, the crew might have tried to eject or disarm it, only for the weapon to detonate and tear open part of the submarine. Some investigators ran detailed simulations of how such an accident could unfold. In one reconstruction, the crew detects a hot-running torpedo, and the commanding officer orders an immediate hard turn to activate its safety features. Before they can complete the maneuver, the torpedo's battery fails catastrophically, triggering a low-order explosion that rips open part of the forward hull. Seawater floods in, the boat loses buoyancy, and as the crew tries to blow ballast to surface, the submarine simply cannot stop its descent. Within roughly 90 seconds, in this scenario, Scorpion would pass her crush depth and be destroyed. It is a chilling thought, from the first sign of trouble to total destruction in less time than it takes to boil a kettle. There were other technical theories as well. Some officers suspected a malfunction in the trash disposal unit or another hull penetration that allowed seawater to rush in at a dangerous depth. Others pointed to possible shaft failure near the propeller, which could have caused sudden flooding in the engine room. In each of these scenarios, a relatively small mechanical problem, a valve sticking, a seal failing, a piece of equipment misoperated in the dark, could rapidly escalate in the unforgiving environment of the deep ocean. Then there is the most controversial theory of all, that Scorpion was attacked. 1968 was an unusually deadly year for submarines. In just a few months, 4 different boats were lost around the world, including a Soviet ballistic missile submarine and others from France and Israel. Some authors have argued that Scorpion, sent to watch a Soviet task force, may have been tracked and targeted in return, struck by an anti-submarine torpedo in a clash both navies later agreed to bury in secrecy. This theory leans on fragments of declassified information, eyewitness claims about torpedo sounds on SOSUS tapes, and the broader atmosphere of Cold War paranoia. Supporters of the attack theory also point to the political context of the time. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global confrontation where neither side wanted open war, but both were willing to push right up to the edge of it. Intelligence operations were aggressive, submarine collisions did occur, and both navies occasionally took risks that were never fully acknowledged in public. If a confrontation in the Atlantic had gone too far, resulting in the loss of Scorpion, it is at least conceivable that both sides might have chosen silence over escalation. To this day, none of these theories has been definitively proven. Hydrogen gas, defective batteries, flooding, or a hostile torpedo, each has evidence both for and against it. The Navy has revisited the loss multiple times, and veterans groups have called for the investigation to be reopened, but the official position remains that no single cause can be confirmed. For the families of the 99 men who died, that ambiguity is its own kind of cruelty. It is hard to grieve something you still don't fully understand. Decades after Scorpion went missing, the submarine still sits where she fell, 3 kilometers down on the edge of the Sargasso Sea. Inside her broken hull are the remains of her crew, a nuclear reactor, and 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. The US Navy has quietly revisited the wreck site over the years, not only to check whether anyone has disturbed it, but also to test for radioactive leakage. So far, the reports that have been made public suggest that the reactor and weapons remain largely intact, their materials sealed inside the wreck or buried in the sediment. But the very idea that a nuclear submarine lies crumpled on the seafloor is a reminder of how high the stakes were, and still are, beneath the waves. Scorpion was not the only submarine lost in that era. In the same year, 1968, 3 other boats from 3 different nations vanished. A Soviet missile submarine in the Pacific, and the French and Israeli boats Minerve and Dakar in other corners of the sea. Taken together, they marked one of the deadliest years in submarine history, a grim reminder that this kind of warfare was as dangerous for those who sailed the boats as it was for any potential enemy. Even the most advanced technology of the time could not fully tame the ocean. The loss of Scorpion changed the Navy in subtle ways. Safety programs like SubSafe were treated with even greater seriousness. Design flaws in weapons and batteries were scrutinized more aggressively. Commanders became more willing to pull aging boats from service rather than accept unnecessary risk. And yet, the Cold War went on. New submarines were launched, new patrols were sailed. The tip-to-tip dance of undersea espionage continued for decades, often just as dangerous, but mostly hidden from public view. For the families of the men who served on Scorpion, the story is much more personal. Many of them went years without clear answers. Some became amateur investigators, tracking down declassified documents, interviewing retired officers, and pushing for new inquiries. Others tried to move on, building lives that always had an empty chair at birthdays, graduations, and weddings. When the Navy finally released some of the photos of the wreck in the 1980s, a few relatives described feeling two conflicting emotions at once. It was comforting to know where their loved ones rested, and horrifying to see the mangled remains of the machine that had taken them there. In 2012, a large association of U.S. submarine veterans formally asked the Navy to reopen the investigation into Scorpion's loss. The request was denied. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, the questions lingered. That's the nature of disasters that happen far from shore. There are no eyewitnesses with clear phone footage, no intact wreck that can be raised into a shipyard. There is only a pattern of dents in the metal, a few lines of acoustic data, and the human instinct to try to make sense of them. Today, when we talk about tragedies at sea, we often focus on the ships and submarines that we can see. Ferries that capsize near shore, modern submarines whose fates unfold in real time online. USS Scorpion is different. Her story unfolded in static and silence, in classified memos and grainy black and white photos taken miles below the surface. We know that 99 men went to sea and did not return. We know roughly where and when their boat died. We know the ocean crushed their ship with a force no human could survive. But as for the exact moment when a normal Cold War patrol became a fatal chain of events, that part of the story is still lost somewhere in the dark water. In the end, that may be what makes Scorpion's disappearance so haunting. It isn't just the technology, or the nuclear weapons, or the Cold War intrigue. It's the simple, human fact that sometimes, even with all our machines and models and reconstructions, the ocean keeps its secrets. A submarine vanishes beneath the waves, a line of families waits on a pier for a boat that will never arrive, and the rest of us are left with a question that may never be fully answered. What really happened in those final minutes, in that narrow tube of steel, as the pressure rose and the lights went out?